will say initially today something that I might repeat at some point. You know, my idea for the title for this series was not modern women artists. I had something a little bit inflected slightly differently, which was some modern artists who are women, because they don't, the people would be looking at, some of them didn't align themselves necessarily with other women who didn't frame themselves and their careers as being female artists. And also it's because I wanted to show them in the context of what other artists were doing at the time. So just kind of like keep that in the back of your mind, because yet again today I'm going to be showing you a bunch of art by men as well as women. So most of today, if not all, I'll spend on Helen Frankensteiler, who's not the author of this painting. This is one you saw last week. That's Sonia Delaney from about 1913, 1914. Because there are various personal history and artistic ambition parallels between these two women. Helen Frankensteiler burst on the scene in the very middle of the 20th century. So there's like almost a half century difference in their work, but they're both intensely interested in color. And again, looking at Sonia Delaney's, this one just called Electric Prism, just myself looking at it more and recalling something I did not tell you, I think is a statement made by her husband, Robert, which is that color is the surface of the earth, the skin of the earth, that everything we see in color. So even though it's abstracted, all the world that's represented in their work is shown in color. So what I did not mention about this one last time of a Paris, must be nighttime street scene with the electric light and the kiosk here, is that there are no lines. All edges are made by the shifting from one color to another. And any suggestion of depth is made by the relationship of one color to another. This you would call abstract art. It still has a kernel of representation in it, whether it's that halo of light up here around the street light, or here we'd assume this is around a head of this sort of pod-shaped form that must be a body of a person walking on the street. And then the kiosk itself, whose form emerges only from the shifts in colors right here, with the one identifying feature to tie it down, to give us a clue with a name right in here. So before talking about Helen Frankensteiler, I'll just show you one of hers. This is you're not even gonna get her dates yet. This is a painting that's in the Whitney, and it's called The Flood. Now, to some extent, Helen Frankensteiler, when having interviews, even with her rather adoring biographer, would sometimes seem to want to tamp down how much color meant to her. But as we look at it, color is a premier factor. This is a painting that's in the Whitney, and it's called The Flood. And I want to read to you just what is on the Whitney online label for this. Helen Frankensteiler never completely abandoned commitment to representation. So that would be saying that this is an abstract work too, rather than a non-representational work. Her work consistently evokes natural scenes. simplified landscapes, layers of sky, cloud, mountain, forest, water. Zones of orange, pinks, greens, and purple evoke different emotional states. Hue and shape become purveyors of place and feeling. And then something she provided to the Whitney for it was, I think of my pictures as explosive landscapes, worlds and distances held on a flat surface. So I tend to think, okay, and I lose myself in just looking at the color. But we'll see how you think about that as we go along. So there you get her dates. She died only a decade ago. She had a fairly nice long career. And as I tell you about her personal history, which is so very important to her career, I just am fond of this casual portrait of her in her studio. You even see from the size of her brushes that she works on a grand scale. And I at least read into that a woman whose pose just expresses extreme self-confidence. And she's certainly a very attractive, very dynamic person. There is a brand new, really biography of 10 years of her life that was recently reviewed in the New Yorker by Alexander Nemiroff, the son of the poet Howard Nemiroff, who taught at Bennington, where she went to college. And I'll quote you some from Alexander's book in a little while. It's worth getting. It's called Fierce Poise, and I borrowed it from the library, so I know it's available in our system. She grew up with great privilege. Her father was a state Supreme Court judge, and he'd had a very successful career in law before. When he died, one of the pallbearers was Abe Bean, and I think whoever was governor at the time was in there too. So she had a family background of this very illustrious and very well-to-do father. She grew up on Park Avenue on the Upper East Side. The youngest of 3 girls. Her sisters are 5 and 6 years older than she was. And she was adored. Her father adored her. This is a really funny anecdote, bizarre anecdote, if you ask me, in Nemiroff's book about how her father doted on her. When she was learning to be potty trained, he was having a dinner party with all these illustrious people in their Park Avenue apartment. And she marched in and announced that she just used her potty. And her father made everybody get up from the table and go look. So she was accustomed to being a center of attention. And her father would, just walking behind, just say, look at that wonderful girl, just look at her. I mean, who was it? I think I heard something like this about Beverly Sills had a mother like that too, seeing as what a precondition for a person to be just a luminary is to grow up with that secure knowledge that you are wonderful. So she knew she was wonderful, and she was interested in the visual world from the time she was very young. She would, another anecdote, she would pour her mother's red nail polish into the sink and watch it swirl around and see the color patterns. Her enlightened parents made sure, she had a sister who went into publishing, and then another sister did the more conventional thing and got married. But all 3 girls were very well educated. She went to Brearley and to Dalton. And she did have a shaking experience when she was an adolescent. Her father died when she was 11. And she was really in a tailspin for more than a year. but she found several teachers who helped her pull out of that. And when she was always interested in art, not certain whether she wanted to write about art or to be an artist, but it was just the visual realm was her thing. For college, she went to Bennington. Now, what's the advantage of going to Bennington? She graduated in 1949. Bennington in the 40s, of course, is a women's school, provided that great advantage that everyone who was a star, whether on the athletic field, in governance, in academics, was a woman. So you just grew up in a world where women were expected to be able to do everything, quite, in a sense, hermetically sealed from what's going on in the outside world. And she had a marvelous art teacher there, a man who was besotted with cubism. For example, in her art classes, they would take paintings, not, those of you who've had taken studio art classes, you know about having class critiques. Well, that's generally when you're a student, you put your work up and everybody in the class talks about it. But he would bring in reproductions of works by Picasso, by Braque, by Matisse, and then ask students to gather around and go over the paintings inch by inch. Does this succeed here? Does this succeed here? What if this color was different here? What if this shape was different over there? So incredibly analytical, and again, taking the greats as being your peers. So this is just a phenomenal way to start out. So she graduated, and that summer in college, having decided she was going to be a studio artist, she rented a studio on East 21st Street. Now, this is a girl with sufficient financial backing to be able to afford a studio. She did share it with a friend. And very shortly after she moved down there, she moved someone whose photograph we're going to see in a moment, who's instrumental in starting her career, the revered and feared art critic, Clement Greenberg. And I'll talk about his theories and how they're involved in mid-20th century art. And here she is. This is this year after she graduated from college. At Greenberg's suggestion, she went up to Provincetown, Massachusetts to an art school taught by Hans Hofmann during the summers. So he was leading her toward further exploration in what she does. You see another virtue she had. She was beautiful and full of life. So she drew people to her, not always admiringly, but she drew people to her. And by the time she was 24, she'd had 2 solo shows in Manhattan. So this is a career that exploded from the beginning. In college, then, she was especially steeped in the aims and ambitions of Cubism, what Cubism sought to do, as well as what it looked like. Now, here's a painting she did called Provincetown. She did it the summer after that, the photograph you just saw. Oh, no, it's the same summer. Provincetown Bay, and it's small. This is 1.5 feet by 2 feet. The allusions to landscape are, it's much more explicit here. You see a clear horizontal skyline, the lighter colors of the sky, the blues of the sea. These lines would be the piers. And she recorded at some point being extremely exasperated with a fellow student telling her that it would be much better if she made the pier disappear into the water as it did as you look at it. Because her interest was to make a painting that looks absolutely flat. So you wouldn't want something that disappeared into the water, because then you have the illusion of depth, something hidden behind something else. Now, this concern, this extreme concern with being flat, will be something that Greenberg emphasized, and is a movement in mid-20th century American art. It was a part of a new kind of realism. What's real isn't the subject, but it's the paint and the canvas. And you want to show that you're putting paint on a flat canvas. These are the objective realities. Now, abstract expression is also about subjective realities. It's the subjective reality of the artist. And as someone else will say, it's using paint as the medium of expression, not subject matter. It's the pigment itself, and the way you apply the pigment expresses the artist's inner state. Not here, but that's, I'm a little bit getting ahead, as you're getting an extremely canned version of the development of arts in mid-century America. So this is back to Robert Delaunay. And you see, although he was, and Cubism is never interested in flatness. It's really forms that seem to project forward, or they're faceted shapes that move around in space, as he does there. And she's, as a city girl, not going to show the city. She's going to show the country. So this is a painting by her, 1950 also. This is called Beach. Well, it is in some senses truly beach, because it's mixed media on canvas. She has sand, plaster of Paris, and coffee grounds in here with color. She explained, why did she use that? Because it reminds you of the surface of the painting, as well as, of course, the surface of as you're walking on the sand. But the limitation in colors and these sort of jagged edges, you see, that is something she's carrying over from her teacher's focus on Cubism. This is the Picasso, early part of the century. But she's merged with something else that we'll get to in a moment, kind of surrealism. It has a kind of freedom and spontaneity in these curving shapes. Here comes one of those many strikes of luck in her relatively golden life at many points. This painting was exhibited in a Manhattan gallery. By this time, she's having this 5-year affair with Clement Greenberg, who you're going to know more about with the next image. But Clement Greenberg, who was already an influential critic and the most extreme advocate for mid-1950s American abstract expressionism, he really made that out of all the things that were going on in art in America, and especially in New York. He plucked that out as being the one that is important, is key, is seminal, has all the weight of being important for eternity. Well, he had a friend who had a gallery called the Goose Gallery in New York. And in the year before, he and the leading art historian, advocate of modern art, who taught at Columbia, a man named Meyer Shapiro, who was also a friend, and that Helen had taken some classes with him. They, in the previous year, had selected worthy unknown artists to be shown in its Goose Gallery. And then in 1950, not Greenberg himself, but an artist he favored named Adolf Gottlieb chose Helen Frankensteiler to be one of the unknown important artists to be on the scene. Now, this is Greenberg operating in the background. He never wrote anything about her art. He's suggesting who she studied with, who she meet. They talk at length about different works of art, just as she had with Feely. So she's absorbing everything he has to say. Here he is much later. He was, when they met, I mean, he was divorced, 20 years older than her. And his background was also New York Jewish, but of a really modest kind of mercantile background. And it took him a while to find his way. He dabbled in painting, but he was a much better writer. And by 1950, he was quite a feared critic for the incisiveness of his criticism. And he, as I say, he especially pushes abstract expressionism. And with abstract expressionism in New York in the 50s, one other underlying, well, it's probably overarching theme, I would say, or concept that comes out in Greenberg's work is that this shows America has now supplanted Europe. The center of the art scene is no longer Paris, it's Manhattan. Well, of course, you had all the immigrants who came over during World War II, but I was saying that it's the modern young American artists who are the future. They are the now and they are the future. Well, the Museum of, the Met Museum was slow to get on to this concept. In fact, was not particularly interested in modern or contemporary art. But in about 1950, 1949, 1950, they had a show of modern painting, which I don't even know what the paintings were in it. That everything I read about it was pretty anemic. It was just sort of like watered down what was going on in Europe. And they didn't show any of the young artists in Manhattan at that time. So here you have a photograph that appeared in Look magazine. The photograph has acquired a name called the Irascibles, like the angry men, because these are men who got together and wrote a petition to the Met saying, you haven't shown any of our work, you know, and you ought to. So I thought you should see who some of these are. Here's Jackson Pollock. Now that is the artist Clement Greenberg picks out as the greatest of them all. The most revolutionary, the most profound. So there's Clement Greenberg. Here's Willem de Kooning. Here's Mark Rothko. Here's Barnett Newman. Here's her future husband, Robert Motherwell. But I am in a moment going to show you a work by de Kooning, Newman, Rothko, and then at greater length, a few by Pollock. So they have this glare to express their intensity, their objection, the ferocity of their ambitions. There is one woman who grew up in Europe, and I don't even remember her name. She's kind of disappeared from the scene. But you see, I was a man's world. So what was the work these men were doing around 1950? This is the scene into which Helen is going to move. This is by Willem de Kooning, and it's called Excavation. It's, let me tell you how big it is. It's 6 feet, 8.5 inches by 8 feet. The largest painting he'd done to date. And in retrospect, another feature of the art from this time will be its size. The retrospectives of Americans looking back saying, this is the age of American triumphalism, where cars were big, ambitions were big, our claims on Europe were big, artists were big, everything was big. Even though the artists didn't necessarily have money, and but they're working on that scale. So in this painting, it too would go under the category of abstract. There are representations. You can see fragmented bits of human forms. There are teeth. He'll later do a series of women who have great Colgate toothpaste, grinning smiles. There's some teeth. Here's some eyes. Sometimes you get forms that look like they're sort of like flailing limbs. He said it really came from something he saw in a neorealist film, that he got this idea, but this all over edge to edge teeming, something going on, vigorously painted, where you follow the way he's painting it all the way. There's another thought current that feeds into this, especially in the American painters in New York, although it's a European-based movement, and that's Surrealism. This is a painting in the modern by Juan Miro, the Spanish artist. It's called The Hunter. Now, there's a Surrealism, as in Dali's Surrealism, that emphasizes very much the sort of the Freudian unconscious, the eruption of your dreams into something in life. But this, in Miro's and some others, it is rather more childlike, playful, no longer controlling how things come. It has just that sort of the innocence and the tumble that a dream might. There are, again, some representational forms. This is the hunter back here. Here's he smoking his pipe. Here's his heart. But there are various biomorphic forms scattered here and there. So this idea of these scattered biomorphic all over the surface work, there are other, I just picked this out as an example of the surrealism visible in New York. But so that and Cubism both go ultimately into abstract expressionism. Now this is back to Helen. This is a work she did just in paper. It's only 5 feet high. And it's called Sightseers. But you see how much she's taking in what de Kooning is doing? Just right away, oh, I can do that too. Bits of eyes, bits of human form, some teeth, some crayons, some painting. Look at this again in comparison. So there's de Kooning working on that very large scale. Now, these artists do not work as a school in ways that look similar, but their size and, in Greenberg's view, the fact that they emphasize flatness, that to him, this is almost like the holy grail of painting, is to make a painting that is flat, that emphasizes the material flatness of the canvas. So here's a Mark Rothko from that time, which is also 1950. And this is in the modern, with his signature areas of color that even though it's the vertical painting, the horizontals do suggest, again, kind of striations. You get landscape, sky. But what color is all important. Or Barnett Newman. This is also in the modern. This is, it's called Sublime and Heroic Man. And the size of this one is, well, I guess I didn't write it down, but I know I can show it to you. We're looking at this next one. When there's a viewer. Newman said he wanted the paintings to be as if you were meeting a person, that you were to be up close to it. And it was as if you were encountering a person, and there would be this kind of interaction with them. And of course, you can look very carefully at the shifts in color. He's interested in color theory and one color next to another, as in these stripes here. So it's just, this is quite effective as flat, although flat red with nothing like a stripe to go either over it or under it would be necessary to make it absolutely flat. So these are artists working with these in different ways, personally exploring these aspects of scale, self-assertion, self-revelation, because these are now painters also growing out of that with surrealism, that you are expressing something of your inner state, your inner life. You're not recording something from the external world. Before we get to Motherwell, I want to talk just a bit, because it's going to be Motherwell and then it's related to what she does, something really specific. It's about the size of these paintings. Like, how do you paint them? Well, there had been other people doing large paintings before. If you did mural paintings like Jackson Pollock's teacher did, well, of course, you are, and large painters do now. Large painters like Alex Katz, they stand on ladders. You paint a part and then you move the ladder and you come down and do another part. Or large paintings weren't new at that time. These are Monet's water lilies at the Rangeri in Paris. These very large paintings that completely make your environment. And I brought them in. They weren't done until the 1920s. Here's a detail. But because I have this most wonderful photograph that shows Monet, here, of course, it's posed, so he's not actually painting. He's too well dressed for painting it. But that you could see that he can stand on the ground and paint these large paintings. Then look at Jackson Pollock. Clement Greenberg and Helen Frankensteiler had had dinner with Jackson Pollock and his wife, Lee Krasner, who was also a painter. One night when Jackson Pollock had a show on in a gallery called the Betty Parsons Gallery, a major gallery in Manhattan. And they had a very pleasant evening. Greenberg hadn't shown any reproductions or of Pollock's work with Helen. So he took her to Pollock's show and she was blown away. This is what she later said about it. It's as if I had suddenly went to Lisbon and knew Portuguese, but I had read enough and I had a passionate enough interest in Lisbon and was eager to live there. I mean, I wanted to live in this land and I had to live there, but I just didn't know the language. The painting just thrilled me. Now there were, this one is, but you might know it's at the Met. It's more than 8.5 feet high and 17 feet long. So like the Barnett Newman, you get close and this painting is your complete environment. You don't need a landscape. This painting is your landscape, all you can see. Public found these things quite perplexing. Like this cover done by Norman Rockwell, even is in the 60s. I really enjoy this with the man in the gray flannel suit trying, you would guess, with all intensity to like this, but it's what a confrontation of two societies in this. We're also, I like this, just serendipity that the next artist we're going to deal with is a Negro artist. But so she saw this one, this autumn rhythm. And this one, this is number 1. And this one, which is called Lavender Mist. And here's a detail. What she saw that he was doing, that of course has made Pollock famous for everyone who's ever had art history, or even at the time, was that he did not use a brush and he did not have the painting up vertically. He did not stand in front of it and paint so that he could stand back from it, look at it, approach it, see the whole thing, come back and work at it. This he did, as you know, I'm assuming everybody knows. He tacked it on the floor of his little studio. And then he couldn't afford, he's poor as a church mouse. They couldn't heat their house even. He used just regular enamel paint. He didn't use artist paint. He just bought gallons of paint, which he thinned with turpentine, sometimes not, and dipsticks and, just various implements, not brushes. And then he would move around the whole painting, spreading the color. One of the truisms is that one reason he was able to do this is that he was born in Wyoming, and he knew about Indian sand painting. So he had seen painting on the ground rather than looking at it. But it's, when you look at that image and maybe when you look at this one, the artist has to have a completely different relationship to his painting. He can't see the whole thing at once. He can't get away from it other than maybe he could stand up and look at it. He can, when he's working on it, he cannot see the edges. He can't see what's going on. So one of the terms that will be used for this, and Greenberg used it too, is action painting, because what you have is the record of the painting actions where he moves his arm and dips the paint. I remember when this kind of work was new, there was even an article, must have been in Life magazine, where they gave some chimps paint and saying, can chimps do this too? Is there anything in this? Well, this is actually, it took practice and skill to be able to do this, which I, to some degree, didn't fully understand until I read something that physicists study this painting, because there's no place in this drip color. It doesn't coil the way it does, say, if you pour syrup or oil. When you pour something, it naturally, when it lands, it makes a spiral. And there are no spirals anywhere in here. So he has to have been working very fast, and he has to have been fully aware of that to keep this fully flat. And he thinned it in various ways to do that. So he's in control of the technique, and he's in control of the imagery. And this is fully revealing yourself when you reveal all your actions like this. Not taking time to think about what you're doing. There's no even interior editing going on. So that blew her away, plus the flatness. Now this is a painting that she did that same year, called an abstract landscape. I would not show it if it weren't for what's going to come after this. But you see how this fits in, sort of that, a little bit like de Kooning, a little surrealist, a little that, but these are still bounded shapes, colors. You can definitely see landscape elements in here. Leaves, trees, maybe suggestion of a sun. But then this is generally taken to be the seminal painting, the painting that she produced that is the landmark painting in mid-20th century art. And it's called Mountains and Sea. And it's 1952. And let me tell you, size, it's 7 feet by 10 feet. And it's the technique that we're going to be looking at. But first we look at a couple of the details. And to accompany my cat's chorus, I want to recommend to you a book. 444 pages, and I don't know how many pounds this is, of her paintings, written by the former chief curator of the Museum of Modern Art, or whether you think, or people think that she's a significant artist. And this is, he talks in great detail about this painting and the elements in it, and I will come back to it. She had just been, I'll give you the kind of her personal background to this. She'd just come back from a trip to Nova Scotia, where she'd been doing some landscape painting. And she said, you know, one of the remarkable things about the landscape there, it's like the West Coast out by Big Sur. It's unusual to have the mountains come right down to the sea. And so she was trying to capture that. So her process when she painted this, she just made some charcoal lines as a kind of a guidance. And then she started to paint. But what she did when she painted, she said sometimes it was partly out of just laziness. She took this great big piece of cotton duck, tacked it to the floor, a la what Pollock did, and she didn't prime or size the canvas. She didn't put anything on the canvas like sizing, which is like a glue that keeps the paint from sinking into the fibers of the canvas. And with oil paints in particular, over time, that rots the canvas. Or primer, which is, well, in her day, it was generally just a really thin, opaque layer that kept the paint on the surface so it didn't sink into the canvas. So your colors would be more vivid and you had control of it. She painted on unprimed, unsized painting. Canvas. And that means the color will bleed. And I'll show you. Let's see what we can. Here she is in front of it. Here's the painting, just part of it. Look at that detail. Now I'm going to show you that part of the painting in a detailed slide. Look at it again in terms of the whole painting. It's that section right here. It makes oil paint look more like watercolor. And how could you get flatter than that? The painting is a canvas. It's a colored canvas. It's not like Pollock's where it's enamel paint sitting on top of the canvas. You see, she does sometimes use drops. She painted this in a day. She said she got started and then she didn't really use these lines that had been there to give her something to start with. She had a studio colleague in a room next to her, and she asked him to come over and look. She got up on a ladder and looked at it, and they decided it was finished. And Greenberg came over that night and they decided it was finished. And she just started to work this way. And this is called, she just called her technique, it's staining. So I brought you several images of her painting as she does it. She is a marvelous dancer, and she has quite balletic movements. And with her wealth also, she doesn't need to sell these things, nor does she need to save her money on how much canvas she buys. So she can paint big from the beginning. So there are no preliminary sketches for here. All her action is as she's working on the canvas. Or here. I'm sure you could, as Pollock did, sort of cut an edge off if you didn't like what was going on someplace, or cut the painting. But she said, oh no, she just threw yours away. So you have no idea how many experiments there were. So here, something she said about this. The landscapes in Nova Scotia were in my arms as I did it. Now that sounds awfully, what? She'd been painting landscapes, on an easel while she's in Nova Scotia with her arms. So the kind of the gestures and where she put things, that kind of body memory was in there. So she said, I didn't realize what I was doing. I was trying to get at something. I didn't know what it was until it was manifest. And later she says, it looked to many people like a large paint rag, casually accidental and incomplete. There's a later one. That's what you do to get to see what you're doing. So I don't paint myself, but I think about the bravery, how much you have to give away control, conscious control, when you're only seeing a small part at a time and you're working without knowing what's going to come out of your hand or where you're going to move next, that this is a spontaneous creation. Now, she was not the only woman who worked in this new idiom, who was trying to find space in a kind of a crowded room, these abstract expressionist artists. Here's Joan Mitchell, and this is Grace Hartigan. This is some years later, and I think this is one of her paintings back here. The men were vicious toward one another, and the women were too. It's something that Joan Mitchell, who really disliked Helen Frankensteiler, said, what she said has stuck or been repeated in various ways. She says, Helen Frankensteiler, she's a Kotex painter. Now, that's not a theme that didn't get picked up on until the 1990s, in the age of feminism. But in this Alexander Nemiroff book, I'm going to read you a quote where you see how much this is now prevailing. Because what's meant, this is like saying blah, what's meant by Kotex painter, saying, seeing menstrual blood on a pad. That's the individual woman's staining the origin of this. It's like, okay, but this is now in Joan Mitchell's day, of course, the macho men, there could hardly be a greater put down. Now it's seen as a celebration of femininity. So this is what Alexander Nemiroff wrote about the stain technique as an allusion to menstruation. It rhymes with a feeling in Helen's paintings of a resolutely private experience made public in an unapologetic and fearless way. It is as though each painting were a grand variation on a first physical blotch, a humble first note, the painting that left the studio, the painting that hung on the gallery wall, offered such a range of experiences and emotions that it might disguise how it had all started with a gesture connoting such a private and bodily function. This was written after her death. I have strong suppositions that she would object to that mightily. But this new staining technique, she showed to Greenberg, and once, probably when she was out of the studio, and she was doing these staining paintings in about 1953, he invited several other artists to come in and see it. One of them was Morris Lewis, who did this painting called Tat. And Kenneth Noland is another one, where they would just pour and drip on on unprimed canvases. And he then Greenberg gave this a name called this color field painting. Now, Helen was flattered that he had brought other artists in to see what she was doing, but she and Greenberg, well, she broke up with Greenberg in 1955, and in revenge, he praised their work and never mentioned hers as an originator of this style. Now I'll just go through and show you a variety of her paintings in color and what she does, because there is, it shifts through her long career, except the size stays the same. So I'll just give you names and give you sizes so that you have some idea. This is called Eden. It's about 11 feet across, 12 feet high. Now here they're clearly representational parts. They're numbers, a hand. Is there a theme in here that has particular meaning to her? Is there a theme that people can find? Well, it depends who looks. You might say this is something of a tree. There are various forms. Someone says, she looks down as if a fish swimming up out of the sea. As you look at a section like this, you see it, they really sort of evoke all kinds of individualized poetic reactions from whoever looks at them. That the emotion comes from you. She doesn't especially show emotion. Homage to Chardin. Well, if you're following the Frick series on curator, the cocktails with a curator, that always starts with a detail of a Chardin painting with purple plums. So I'm sure that's the source of the purple forms here. Well, I mean, why the name comes, of course, these are paintings that are named after they're done. She insisted that for her, even the color is line. This would be thick line as opposed to these lines here. And she downplayed color because the negative comments about her is that she's too pretty. Let's see, what are some of the other negative things they say? Her art is thin in substance, uncontrolled in method, too sweet in color, too poetic. But she said, no, I'm saving about color. If I bought a lot of colors, I need to use them. So, you know, it's as if slightly like, oh, colors just because I'm, you know, thrifty. In 1958, she did marry. She married Robert Motherwell. If she represents what's called the second generation of abstract expressionists, he was the youngest of the first generation. And here she remarried a man who was her intellectual and financial peer, as well as a marvelous artist. This is at their wedding. He was 49 and she was, no, 42 and she was 29. And I did not know until recently, I've always admired his art. He grew up with a completely brutalized childhood. Examples of his work, you might know, he did this series of Spanish elegies, or later on, he did a series of painting a day on paper, where you see he's using blue ink on Japanese rice paper, and he's borrowing her staining technique. But they worked side by side, influencing one another more or less, but it was that they certainly were what we call the golden couple in the art world. And here's a fact that's as significant as any about her, or I mean, as startling. It's not significant, but to put her in place, the two of them had a dinner party at their, I think they had a Park Avenue apartment as well. Well, anyway, it was on the Upper East Side for a visiting British sculptor, and they invited 100 guests. Now here, just to have a gallery view, of course, it's with the wide angle lens, the room and the pictures will look even larger, but you get the idea of the size of them. I'm going to show you this one and this one. This is before the caves. There's drawn, dripped, pulled, and painted strokes on here. A whole vocabulary. She and Robert had been, they spent a long vacation, honeymoon vacation in Spain, and they'd been to the caves at Lascaux. And that inspired her to do this. Mother Goose melody. Well, there are recognizable forms here. Here's the Mother Goose. The name probably given afterwards, but it may be putting a name to something that, you know, is coming up from inside her with that same welling up from the unconscious. Here, a clock. If it's almost 7 o'clock. She often uses 3 forms in her work, like that. Then she began to mix acrylic and oil paint. This is the Gulf Stream. Here's another one, because now it's, and we'll just give you some idea of her variety. The Pink Lady. It's more and more color, which she still sees as line, but looks more like just areas of color to us. Parade, using a vertical canvas. This is in the 60s. And then she moves into paint, veils of paint over almost all of the canvas. This one is called Newfoundland, where she had been. And the big change she made late in her life is that she began to do prints. She did lithographs, and then she got interested in wood blocks. Now, what could be more unlikely than wood, which has to be carved and has very firm forms, natural to it, for her to do something with color that moves all over as she does. This is actually a lithograph she did, but I'm going to finish with a couple of her woodblock prints. This is called Essence Mulberry. It's from 4 woodblocks. And then she left, and then part of the paper, which is mulberry paper, was left plain. It's called Essence Mulberry because the shop she was working with outside had a mulberry bush, and she crushed the mulberries and said, "That's the color I want." And then the rollers that rolled on the paint had the multicolors on it. And then this would be separate blocks put on here. So she, working in collaboration with the finest technicians and printers, has managed to translate that same aqueous all over quality to her prints. Look at that close up. She did some prints that show the nature of the wood, but she was still painting too. Now these paintings, this is called A Garden Thought in a Green Shade. That comes from a poem actually, but here people see in this, well, maybe this is that sense of the flecks of flowers in the garden, and also drips going back to Pollock. And this is from the 1980s. So she's been painting a long time. It really depends how you like color. If you're going to say, there's not enough to this, it's just color. It's not worthy to be a painting. Or this is like, oh, I can lose myself in this. Another one of those late ones. And then, oh, I think I'll just show you one final print. This is called Madame Butterfly. This is from 2000. There are 46 woodblocks in this and 102 colors. She would paint on maquettes and paper pulp, and then had fine carvers translate this onto wood, and then they would apply the color to the wood. So she's working collaboratively at the end of her life. And here's one of the woodblocks. So I certainly cannot tell you what you should make of her. But she had a long and effective career, and actually she was, well, Louise Nevelson, we'll see her work later on, said, oh, she knew how to use everybody. She used Clement Greenberg, she used everybody, but you could say everyone used her too. So that's the art world. And next time, because this is just at the time, for something completely different, we'll look at Faith Ringgold, and I think also move into photographers. So our time is up, but there is free time. So if you have either comments or questions, please bring them on. I have to figure out how to get out of this first.
Maggie,
Unless there's anything you want me to go back to show.
oh, the whole thing.
You like her?
Oh, I never knew anything about her. This was absolutely mesmerizing.
Well, I had the worst time. I mean, other than, it's a good thing I live close enough to the library that I could carry this book home. I was like,
oh, I was going to ask you for the designation, the name and author, but that's available from our library in Montclair?
This is James Elderfield. He was the Elderfield. I think this came in on interlibrary loan, but yeah, got it through here.
And the title?
Frankensteiler. What more would you need? The title.
Oh, and
James Elderfield.
Elder. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. This is 1989. So it's page after page of illustration, and his texts, I have difficulty sometimes with the evocative writing of some people, as I have trouble with this one about everything is a memory of her first menstrual period. I feel like the slapping the hand of a man who does that. I feel like that's a man encroaching on a woman's stuff there, but he's certainly trying. To choose works for hers, it's like, oh, should I show this? Should I show that? Because they are gorgeous.
Where can we see her work?
She's at the Whitney. She's at the Modern, and I think
there's so much.
I don't know if there's a painting of hers at the Met or not. Someone might be able to remember that better than me.
Okay, I can look it up.
Maggie, I just wanted to ask: do you think she would have been as recognized had she not had the support of Clement Greenberg?
No.
Or Motherwell?
I think not. And the other thing, it irritates me, but it's just reality irritates me. She had all the money to have every advantage. She could go big. She could every summer go to Europe and study the old masters. She could have her own studio when she's 22. Look, even my cat is complaining about it. Female cat here is complaining. Or you could say it's a real confluence. I mean, given those opportunities, she was really able to flourish in the way many people couldn't.
Right, it is somewhat like who she knew and the world she lived in, and being in New York as opposed to the Midwest or so.
That's one of the things that I see is so similar to Sonia Delaney, although Sonia got diverted with the war and losing access to her fortune.
But her having the
really
money,
helps. What?
Her having the money made her an exception to the rule. Was there resentment by the other artists, especially the men who were?
Oh, yes. And then I will give you the one that I had kept out. Toward the end, she was, she had, I'll give you two anecdotes. Toward the end of her life, she was on the board of the National Endowment of the Arts, and she thought the government ought to get out of the arts funding business, And it was especially, she disliked work like Andres Serrano, you know, who did the image of Christ bathed in urine.
Mhm.
She just did not like contemporary provocative art. I mean, so she was instrumental in sort of turning off that cushion of government funding that was allowing artists to do things that were experimental and radical. She didn't need it, they did. And then what was the other one I was going to say? Oh, just lost that. Oh, she and her husband had dinner late in her life after she divorced Motherwell, who was a terrible alcoholic. She married an investment banker, which also in her milieu. But they had dinner at the Nixon White House. And she got to dance with someone. She was a marvelous dancer, and she didn't know who the person was. And she came back and asked her assistant. It was John Travolta. She said at last she danced with someone who was really good. So that's another one of the perks of money.
Did she sell much of her work?
You see, I have had difficulty with this because everything that I've been looking up images, they're saying Helen Frankensteiler Foundation, and they're not saying if they still belong to the foundation or if they have been sold, and it's just the foundation is the source of the imagery. At that scale, I doubt that there are many private clients. There may be, you know, corporate headquarters that have some, and certainly her prints would be possible that way.
Were there no children of all those marriages?
Motherwell already had 2 children, but and she only had one marriage. Well, those 2 marriages. No, she was, as someone said, not the marrying kind. I mean, not the mothering kind. Her mother was a problem. More questions? More about her work?
Well, what do you think of the scale that she operated on? My personal feeling is that if you have a work of that size, it's like automatic impressive.
Right.
You're drawing big everything, so no matter what it is, it's gonna look amazing because it's huge. But if it had been smaller, would it have had the same impact? Did she?
Well, I'm thinking she couldn't have worked in that manner on a small scale, you see. So whatever her development was, it would have had to move in a different way. Because by the time she's doing those prints, she's so locked into that one style and the recognition of that one style that then in those prints, which are smaller, they have to imitate what she was doing in the large painting.
Maggie,
so unknowable. Yeah, what?
I had a comment. I put it in the chat, but I'll just say, when you mentioned about the Kodaks, I was wondering if it had something to do with the fact that the paint was being absorbed into her canvas.
Yes, that's why they came. It was Joan Mitchell's envious response or disparaging response, saying, "Oh, staining like that, yeah, that's Kodaks."
Do you think she ever tried watercolor?
She must have at some point. I mean, when she was at Dalton, when she was at Brearley, when she was in Bennington, she has to have been doing watercolor in some place. But here she is certainly thinning her oils so that they look just like watercolors.
They certainly do. That's what I was going to mention. They do look like watercolors, actually. Mm-hmm.
What's her marketability at this point, if there was?
I think I saw something on a Sotheby's. I don't know when this would have been. It's about $3 million for a painting.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's low comparatively.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that painting, Maggie, that looks really plain, just like a plain old wall with 2 lines going down. What was that
at the Modern by Barnett Newman, the red one?
Was it red or blue? It had 2 stripes on each side, and it was red. It said it was red. Yeah.
Right. Parade.
No.
No. At the very beginning.
It's Barnett.
Yeah.
It was Barnett.
Where did all her money go? Was there a legacy?
Well, Bennington just, the Frankensteiler Foundation has given Bennington $1 million. I don't know where the rest is.
I have an impossible question for you. And the relative value, that 3 million is low current abstract expressionists. It's a low value compared to the others.
And I also don't know, I didn't look to see what the date of that Sotheby's sale was, when it showed on the Google.
Right, but how? And it's an impossible question. How is art valued that way? You know, you're in 7, 8 digits.
Well, let me give you the old, how much time do we have? No, I don't know when the next class starts.
Well, it depends on when your cat needs the lunch.
Sorry.
She's ready.
She's gone on to other things. She's made herself known. Establish, this is, I remember it was, I think Jasper Johns is the first artist who ever had a painting sell for $1 million. And when someone asked him about that, he said, well, that's great, but what does that have to do with art? The art market, which is at least not as bad as it was for a while. The whole procedure goes, first of all, some of this everybody knows, some, I'm not an artist, so this is all secondhand to me. You have to find someone who's going to show your work. Someone who has a gallery. This is before this crypto art comes out. Has a gallery, thinks, I have clients who come by here, they like something like that. I'll show your work. So the gallery owner sets the price according to what other artists are getting in work that looks somewhat like that. Generally, a gallery owner keeps initially about 50% of it, and then 50% goes to the artist. If whoever bought it resells it at a higher price, none of that money goes to the artist.
Right.
So that is what encouraged the really part of the boom in the art market, that people turned, especially in the 70s and the 80s, to using art as an investment, that you get something, if you manage to get an artist whose work is popular, you're going to be able to sell it for more. So it's a sure investment. It's a good, instead of getting gold, you buy paintings. So the prices are really not related to the art at all.
Interesting.
It is.
Discouraging, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really.
Although if you then become a popular artist, the next time you go to your gallery, you can say, no, I want this much more for it. Or you go to another gallery that's a more famous gallery that begins to show your work, and you get more there. So you negotiate your career that way.
You go from off-Broadway to Broadway.
That's right.
Look at someone like Basquiat.
Excellent show.
Is that it? Well, let me look at chat, see if there's anything here that's general.
When is the next lecture?
Next Thursday.
It'll be next Tuesday at 1:30.
Oh, okay. So is this a series of women?
Yes. Oh, thank you. This is what I had wanted to say I said at the very beginning, when I thought people, unfortunately, were still coming in, some modern artists who are women.
Okay.
So next time we'll look at Faith Ringgold for a while, and then I'm going to look at some women 20th century photographers. And we'll make sure at least to say hello and goodbye to some sculptors and some architects as well. So there'll be 4 more lectures.
Looking forward to them.
Yeah, I very much enjoy your lectures. Really.
Good. I do too. except I don't do anything else. Good thing you can't see beyond what's in the screen here. My house.
Maggie, this is our first time taking your lectures. What, if you don't mind, what is your background in art? We very much enjoy
I'm an
it.
art historian. I taught
Oh.
for decades at William Patterson.
Okay.
I'm a docent at the museum too, but my actual doctorate is in late Roman art. I went to graduate school at Michigan, where the virtue of the graduate program was that it expected people would have to teach in areas beyond what their extreme specialty was. So I have a more general background.
Interesting. How did you end up doing this though? I mean, this is Roman is your background? Is
Well, it
Roman
helps
art?
you learn about new things.
Yeah, great. Terrific. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you. Wonderful.